temperature from the lights, wind speed, all of those things dialed in basically so that it's not too stressful for the plants.
Yeah. Do you miss natural light?
I miss farming outdoors a lot.
Yeah.
If, when I was wrapping up my 14 years of farming outside, I was definitely pretty burned out because it's so challenging. The weather alone is enough to make you crazy. I mean, my kids grew up hearing the Weather Channel on just like all day long. Like little kids, like toddlers, dancing to the music of the Weather Channel, like their favorite song. And I was just so dependent upon, what was happening with the weather. What did I have to do? You're working around the clock, and you suddenly there's a storm coming and you have to do all these things before and all these things after, and it throws all your plans off. Where now I have kind of a normal 9 to 5, much more so than I did working outside. And then you have all the issues of the pests populations outside, which the pests can be a whole lot bigger, like groundhogs.
I was just going to say animals.
Yeah, animals and moles and chipmunks.
Deer.
Deer and all those things, which can wipe you out overnight, so I don't miss that. Like my biggest battle was always groundhogs. I mean, it was just a battle from spring to fall dealing with groundhogs. But there was all kinds of other pests. And indoors, you have a more limited type of pests that come in, and they're generally mites and insects for the most part. And, they can be challenging because they can get a foothold in your environment and they'd be really hard to get them out of there. But you still are dealing with less diversity of issues. But it's never quite the same growing indoors as it is growing outdoors because you have the sun, of course, and we still haven't been able to replicate that. And you just have the terroir, of it all, the weather, the soil, all that good stuff that makes your product so unique. So I do greatly miss growing outdoors, and I hope to be more involved in the outdoor production up in Michigan, so I can at least try my hand a little bit at that. But I enjoy growing indoors, I'd say almost equally when you balance all those things out. And what also I do like about growing indoors is you have so many cycles. So like when you're growing outside, you have one season, and it starts in March and it ends in October, and the whole season it's just like this anticipation of what's it going to be, how good is it going to be, how good is it looking come July, like where am I at compared to where I was last year in July. And if you have one bad weather year or you have some other miscalculations, that's it. That was your year. If it's a great year,
you don't get to start over in 8 weeks and try something again. Yeah.
So if it's a great year, you have a great winter and you have some downtime and you can recoup and rest and learn and do all that good stuff. Whereas in cannabis, it never stops and there's no downtime. So it can burn you out faster. But also each cycle is a new chance, so every cycle can be the best one, and you can have 5 or more a year. So you can R&D a lot more indoors because you can trial things much more quickly, where outdoors it's like you don't want to risk too much R&D because if it doesn't work out how you wanted it to do, you're in bad shape. But also you don't see your results until the end of the season. Indoors, you can get your results a lot quicker. So you can learn and make adjustments and develop techniques and processes and trial products and do all those things much faster. Like agriculture is very similar to cannabis advocacy and cannabis business operations. Everything happens so much faster. Like we all use the term, your life was like in dog years or whatever, where every year is 7 years because you age a lot faster in cannabis too. Because the stress of it and the rapid changes can just uproot you in a second. Just from like a legislative perspective, you're always wondering what's going to happen next with banking or with this or with that. And so it's a new type of stress, that you have to accept, and you have to find a rhythm to be able to handle, because it doesn't stop. And you could think everything could be going perfectly, and they could change one regulation and it can throw off your entire business. You know, so it's a different kind of stress. It definitely is a challenge to adjust to, but then it offers all kinds of opportunities that you don't get in other industries as well, for growth and for development of your career and techniques and all that sort of stuff. So it's exciting and it's interesting. And I've always been into that, the exciting, interesting part side of life. So it works pretty good for me. Yeah, I like that.
You know, a question kind of comes up because you worked out in the field and all these variables you just mentioned, and then you go indoors and you can you can protect your crop from a lot of those challenges, those natural challenges that you might deal with outside. You know, I do plants and cannabis or plants in general, do they need to have a super consistent environment that you can give them indoors? Or have you learned from being outdoors, plants are pretty resilient, they kind of roll with the punches, they'll recover, they maybe actually might express some quality characteristics by being, you know, exposed to these variabilities that we just can't or are afraid to recreate indoors?
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic, and it's something I think about a lot, because as I get better at, let's say, dialing in the environment, you know, I have a great building engineer now that is able to really do some pretty advanced programming on our control system. And I've lately been thinking to myself, wait, when am I getting to the point where this might be not stressful enough that I start to see lower potency or lower yield or whatever? But there's still such little knowledge about all that. It's really just, you know, you're really just guessing for the most part as to what is truly happening, because there's so many variables. You know, if you were able to control all the variables except one, and say, when I increase wind speed, the plants are under more wind stress and I see higher potency, that would be great. And then we could take that knowledge and move forward with it. And we do see now, fortunately, a lot more studies being done on cannabis agriculture. And this is an exciting time, because we're going to be able to learn much more about things that we can do like that. But there's still so many variables in an indoor environment that you really never get the chance to look at just one. You know, like, you have doors opening and closing, and you have humidity changes based on the temperature outside, or you have machines that fail on a certain time, or you have, you know, lights that might run hotter under certain, because they're wearing out and they're not all consistent, or, you know, there's so many variables that I found that it's very, very hard to really make a lot of great, you know, analysis out of particular things indoors. My general theory, like my general school of thought, is still keep the plants less stressed in indoor agriculture, because, and probably in outdoor agriculture as well, because there's going to be more than enough stress points that they're going to encounter in their life cycle that we don't really need to add to them. I am probably like at the opposite end of the spectrum, compared to a lot of other growers that really think you need to do a lot of like high stress training, like super cropping or different types of things to potentially increase yields or cannabinoids. And I'm sure there is some science behind different high stress techniques that have an impact. One thing that I have done that is a little higher stress, and this is really just based on, I think it was Darren Kaplan's research, was drought stress. And I do find drought stress kind of interesting. And I had been using some like kind of calculated drought stress in the field for different culinary herbs. So like drought stressing thyme or basil, and there's studies on all of those. So you can always look back to different crops and find drought stress studies. There's hundreds in like aromatic herbs and stuff like that. So I like to dig into a lot of those studies and see, what, if this affects this culinary herb this way, maybe I can try that with a medicinal herb and same benefits. And then now that there's starting to be some studies on cannabis, like the study I was mentioning showed that like drought stress in week 7 raised potency across maybe a couple cultivars. And so I have noticed, at least what I appear is a direct correlation between some induced drought stress in late flower and higher potency. And I think it kind of makes sense because you're withholding water, so you have less like water in the flower, and the cannabinoids or chemical constituents will kind of naturally be a little more concentrated because the biomass is just lower and they have the same amount of chemical constituents there. But also I think, there's definitely some types of stress like that you can incorporate to potentially raise potency. I think I may have been overwatering a bit in late flower earlier, and as I've kind of started to like draw back on water in the last 2 weeks, I have seen increases in potency. Is it directly related to that? Pretty hard to say, because I've done other things too, and I've reduced temperatures more in late flower, and I'm sure there's a bunch of other things that I've changed in how I manage the flowers as I get into late flower. And unfortunately, it's still hard to do a lot of research and development in a commercial cultivation facility because of the way things are regulated. I would love to have an R&D room that was unregulated that I could run 25 plants in and try different lights and try different techniques and different methods, but that then eats into our regulated space for production. So like, it's unfortunate that the way we're regulated in Ohio here, we can't do that. And it happens with plant count and everywhere else too, because you have to subtract from your production to be able to have those same plants to do R&D. So it's really hard.
And they don't care. The regulators don't care if you have an R&D area and separate that from your total plant count or room size or whatever.
I mean, it's something maybe we could discuss more and try and negotiate into the regulations, because it would be helpful for everybody and you could become more sustainable and you could use less energy and do a lot of things. Like CO2 is one I've been thinking about lately. Like when does it make sense to taper off CO2? Like some people run 1500 ppms all the way until the day they cut the plants down. Is it necessary? It's hard to say. Could we be wasting CO2? Probably. Like I taper off usually 2 weeks before harvest and I go down to ambient at the end. Could I do that 3 weeks earlier? Do I even need to go to 1500 ppms? I don't know. It's hard to say. So I think to have more R&D built into regulations would be really helpful, and to be able to, set aside funding to do that. Like, if we could have more funded research, then we would be able to do a whole lot of things that'll really propel us to the next level. And we'll probably realize we were doing things for years and decades that we didn't need to do, that were wasteful, or we weren't doing things that we could have been doing to improve yields or improve potency or all those things. So it's super interesting. I love digging into all the research. I get so excited when new podcasts come out and, new science comes out that shows us how to grow plants better. I mean, it's amazing. And it's cool because it's also new for cannabis. So we're like still on the cutting edge of learning all these exciting things. So I love it. I love all the content now. It's just like I'm like a sponge, just trying to soak it all up,
Agreed. I'm grateful that there's, a growing interest in horticultural science and agricultural science that is being implemented in cannabis farms, indoors, outdoors, and in greenhouses. That sort of that aura of magic is is kind of getting, I don't know, poked through a little bit, and that people are more willing to accept the scientific research that's already out there for other plants, but also that there are researchers, academic and private researchers who are trying to advance the knowledge and answer questions that you may have as a cultivator, even questions we have, right? Like, I wish that I had a lab. I wish that I could run some plants and test a few things ourselves, or validate some of, the models and the assumptions that we have for growing all the plants that we're helping people grow. So yeah, it's a very exciting time because the knowledge is just going to accumulate so quickly. Yeah. um I want to go back just for 1 minute, or a few minutes, about soil and sustainability and being organic. Um, why to you is soil so important? And as a regenerative outdoor farmer, what were some of even the issues that you were dealing with, in terms of the soil that you had on your land? And are you able to sort of mitigate that by having soil indoors? Are you able to control the soil quality better? Or are there things that you wish that you could practice, from outdoors to indoors with that soil?
For sure, yeah. I love soil is one of my favorite topics. I love talking about soil. I definitely am not a soil scientist, and I don't have all the answers. But when I worked in the field, I was in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park area, and there was phenomenal soil already in place where I started my farm. I mean, it was an apple orchard that hadn't been in production for a long, long time, and there was all kinds of brush and small trees and things like that growing on this basically half acre that I ended up working on. And so I was lucky enough to come into a place that had like beautiful topsoil, just great texture, great nutrient levels. I mean, I wish I could work in that kind of soil all the time. It was magical. But anytime you transition over to growing crops, then you're starting to take away from the soil because all the nutrients that those crops are pulling out aren't getting returned to the soil. And all it's kind of like that law of return, where whatever you take away, you have to put back in if you want to maintain that equilibrium. There's a lot more disturbances, of course, that happen with tilling and any kind of products that you're using, and of course, running like a monoculture. If you're growing just one crop, it's going to pull certain nutrients and have a certain effect on all of the microbiological activity in the soil. So I grew a very polyculture style farm there. Actually, I was lucky enough to be in a documentary called Polycultures. I think it was called Polycultures: Food Where You Live, in my first year farming there. And I learned a lot about the value of a polyculture production. So like the polyculture model is like how most or all small farms used to be a long time ago, where people were growing mixed crops and they had animals and it was all a closed system, and they were making their own fertility generated from all the animals and things like that. And they were growing different things and moving them around and growing more sustainably. Like a permaculture style model also is, kind of an older school concept of not tilling and not disturbing the soil and growing trees and mid-sized crops and smaller crops and all that good stuff. So I kind of dove into polyculture agriculture right off the bat after I was involved in that documentary, and really what a profound effect it had on the soil. Because when you're growing a lot of different crops, you have a really great crop diversity, then you have a great microbiological diversity in the soil, and you're returning a lot of crop residues to the soil, and you're able to maintain this quality. Once you start growing just one crop, that's where things tend to go awry. And then also, of course, if you're tilling a lot and you're not reintroducing crop residues or more organic matter back into the soil, then you start to really lose organic matter, and then you start to lose like water holding capacity and microbiological diversity, and basically turn into a dust bowl type scenario. So regenerative farming was really important for me, which regenerative just really means kind of like giving back what you take away. And then also in many cases the soil has already been deteriorated and you're trying to regenerate it to its full potential. So regenerative farming really focuses on soil and soil health, and focuses on adding diversity or improving the microbiological diversity of your soil so that it can be resilient to, climate change and adverse weather events and all that sort of stuff. So soil has always been really important to me. I mean, there's a limited amount of soil on the earth. It's not necessarily a renewable resource. I mean, I don't think it at all is a renewable resource. And depending on who you ask, we have a limited amount of soil left to grow crops on the planet, and it's pretty small. And so we're deteriorating and displacing soil and negatively impacting it much more than we're rebuilding it and regenerating it. So it's really important for all farmers, I think, to think about soil and to try and transition into practices that will conserve or rebuild the health of soils that they're working in.
Can I ask you real quick? So how do you regenerate soil? Are you rotating crops? Are you, during an off season, are you planting nitrogen fixing legumes and clover? Like what? I'm assuming you're doing it in a natural way. You're not just adding a bunch of, fertilizer or manure to try to regenerate it.
Like, so it's pretty much all of the above, and it's pretty complex. I mean, it's like, it takes a long time to really understand how to rebuild soil. I'm still learning a whole bunch all the time, and I've been at it for about 20 years now. But really, you're doing all those things. You're running cover crops, so you're not leaving soil bare. You're mulching with organic materials. You're rotating crops, so you're not growing the same thing in the same place repeatedly. You're composting, so you're composting food waste or yard waste or crop residues, and you're building microbiological diversity. You're taking care of your microbiology in your soil, so you're not allowing it to erode. You're not leaving bare soils in the winter. There's a whole gamut of things of practices that you can do to increase the health of your soil. Generally, it involves with keeping your soil covered for the most part with some sort of organic material, whether your grass clippings are going back into your soil, straw, hay, cover crop residue is a huge one. Obviously, you can add tons and tons of organic matter to every acre by just rotating cover crops. Sometimes it may mean leaving the field fallow and not running any crops that year to rebuild the health. Controlling like your water erosion, wind erosion, just conserving the soil that you have, keeping it in place, which can be a whole bunch of management techniques, from like wind screens to keeping a mulch over the winter, planting cover crops in the fall that'll regrow in the spring to help control water erosion in the spring or wind erosion in the spring. Nitrogen fixers, as you mentioned, mixed cover crops. So a lot of people are using like a nitrogen fixer and a grass crop, or there's a lot of techniques that you can use. Obviously, sheet composting. A big thing that I did at Pint was I would bring down about 10 tons of spent beer grain each spring or each fall, and I would spread that over my fields, and that really added a lot of nutrient to the field and a lot of carbon, and it also fed a lot of the microbiological activity. So like I had enormous amount of earthworms and just all kinds of different arthropods and creatures, everything, snakes and all kinds of cool stuff there that were kind of living off of this ecosystem that I was like nourishing basically every year with a lot of organic material. But it's really sourcing, organic materials, wood chips, sawdust, manure, spoiled hay, a lot of things that you can get for free that are basically a waste product of someone else, and introducing mixed organic residues into your field to then sustain the life, keeping the soil alive for the most part, keeping it healthy, keeping it alive, mixing it up. And then the practices that then you use to grow the food being like the least invasive, no-till, limited till, running, mulching is a huge one, knowing when to put down your mulches, knowing how much mulch you can run. And, like my soil at Pint was so alive that it would just consume things so fast. And that's a real benefit too about working in the outdoors is you have all of this microbiological activity. So like if I put down 2 inches of spent grain over an entire plot in March, by the time I went to put crops in there in April, it was just gone. You know, it was like
really,
yeah, it was like you might see little hulls of some of the grain here and there, but for the most part, like the organisms just broke it down. And if you do that same kind of thing indoors, I mean, it just sits there and rots. You can't expect even beds really to break down material like that because the microbiological activity is just so slow indoors. Greenhouses,
aren't you controlling the environment? It seems like it'd be better.
I mean, if you're using big, enormous beds, then it can be pretty high, but it's just really hard to use that type of setup indoors. It's not really, it's difficult. You can do it on very small scales, but it doesn't work too great on larger scales. And just everything is so much slower, all the metabolic processes of everything.
Because so the plants grow faster, but the microbiomes grow slower?
I mean, I don't know about the plants growing faster, but it's just, I mean, the cycles are faster for sure. And I'm sure there's some microbes that are, reproducing faster and you can keep them alive. It's just hard to keep the balance and the diversity the same. Because outdoors, you have so many things. You have rain, you have, a bird running over the field, dragging all the bacteria on its feet around. You have worms, so many worms. You have all these different organisms, like all the levels of the food soil. What?
Could you imagine if a snake popped out of a pot?
Yeah, like even keeping worms alive, and, it's just so much more challenging because you just don't have the full system. You have like a little slice of the system. Whereas outside,
where do you get your soil to grow indoors? Do you have a regenerative soil? I don't know, a source that you're using? Are you repurposing the soil, your spent soil? Like, how does that work?
So again, it's like I have all the above sort of thing because the soil story is interesting because the first grower that was here, he had a soil that he was purchasing from the West Coast, and it was getting shipped all the way across the country, and it was okay. It didn't seem like the soil.
It just seems wrong, though, right?
Yeah, it didn't seem right, and then it wasn't that great, and it was nothing like the soil I'd been used to working with at my farm. Like it seemed very dead and very one-dimensional. And then I knew I didn't want to use that soil again when I was in charge of picking the soil, and then so I looked to like the main cannabis suppliers and cannabis soil suppliers, and there's a good one on the West Coast that I think is doing a really good job. That's a friend of ours. And then there's one in Colorado that's doing a pretty good job. And the West Coast one, the shipping made it not, cost prohibitive. The Colorado one had free shipping, so I figured I'd go with that. And then I used that soil for one cycle. And again, it was pretty much a letdown. It seemed very one-dimensional and not very alive. And it was okay. I mean, it wasn't bad, but I wasn't super happy with it. And then actually I reached out to
spoiled.
Yeah, I was spoiled. And so I reached out to one of my colleagues, Kevin Jodry, who is a big time humble grower, legacy grower. And he gave me the encouragement to just find a soil producer that was local and work with them to develop a soil that worked well for us.
Nice.
So I reached out to a company called Tilth, who is still the soil supplier that we use now. And the way I knew them was because they were, they picked up our food waste from Great Lakes Brewing Company, and they were a composter at the time. And so they were doing a lot of food scrap composting at scale. Nice. And so I had a relationship with them for 10 years or so. And they were just getting into making potting soil. So I reached out to them and I said, hey, what would you think about trying to develop a soil that would work well for indoor cannabis? And they're like, absolutely.
Hell yeah. Yeah.
So they took their base model soil, whatever, that they were selling to some vegetable growers, and we tried it. They did their own research because they're really into soil science, and they determined that we needed to raise the amounts of certain nutrients that were in the soil to because soil is a high demand, high nutrient, hungry plant. And so we decided we had to crank it up a little bit. And then over each cycle, we tweaked it and we tweaked it. We tweaked the porosity, the drainage, the nutrient levels until we found something that was getting the yields, that we were looking for. And we've stuck with that ever since. And the good thing about that soil is it's local. So it's shipped like 15 miles or something like that, maybe 20. And then the other great thing about it is I have this great relationship with this company, so I can change it and adjust it based on what I'm seeing every time. They have great quality control because they're a small company, so I know it's going to come in how I want it to every time. And then it's also, we've made adjustments to increase potency as well. So like we've made some adjustments to increase yield, but then we also made some adjustments to affect potency. And we saw, like, when I was first growing in that soil, we were averaging 21% THC, and now we're averaging 28.5%, I believe.
That's awesome.
THC, which a lot of that has to do with genetic selection of the cannabis strains. But we found some of the same cultivars to improve as we made these changes in the constituents in the soil.
That's so exciting.
Yeah, so that's been really exciting. But then the other great thing about it is it's 20 to 25% food waste.
Yeah.
So the food waste compost, and they're very selective about how they make their compost. It's all, fruits and vegetables. It's not like yard waste and all that sort of stuff.
Okay.
The food waste that they use is eliminated from the landfills. And so they gather all this great data on how much food waste they've diverted from landfills. And then that food waste is made into compost. And then that compost constitutes 20 or 25% of our soil. So we're able to do another layer of good by preventing that food waste from going into the landfill, because we know that's a huge problem. And then we take the spent soil once we grow. Now we're not reusing the soil here, but we're reusing it in our greenhouses and in our outdoor production in Michigan, because it is a process to recharge it and get it back to the consistency that you want it to have for indoor agriculture. So we don't have the infrastructure here, and we're on a relatively small site to be able to re-amend it and repurpose it to be able to use it back in our grow here. And we're not in beds, which don't work too well on 3 tiers because of the weight load.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And also there's a lot of other challenges with growing in beds, to just having high yield and good consistency, and having pest issues that can carry it into cycle after cycle and all that sort of stuff. There's a lot of challenges to it. Not saying that it's not a good practice and it can't work, because I think in greenhouses it's a great practice. And I think in indoors, in small scale ground floor operations, or maybe even on 2 tiers, potentially it can work. But as you scale up higher, it becomes more and more challenging to duplicate the same, success. But by shipping that material to our other outdoor and greenhouse grow, it's highly valuable. So we're able to get a second use out of it. We've also donated a lot of it that we couldn't ship to community garden centers, to community garden groups here in Akron, and they've built new beds, outfitted new hoop houses and all kinds of stuff with our spent soil, and had great success growing in that as well for vegetable production. So it has a secondary use for sure.
That is so cool.
Hydroponic grows, that rock wool going right into the garbage can, and unfortunately they use so much of the rock wool that it's not only is it unsustainable to keep making it, because it's molten rock. It's like, wow. They say there's some recycling of it that happens, but I don't think there's a whole lot of it.
I don't think there's a whole lot either.
Yeah.
So are you using soil one time in the indoor facility, and then you're repurposing it? Okay. So you don't get multiple cycles from the same soil. Okay.
No.
You could, but with reduced efficacy, right?
How hard we're driving the plants. Really, there's not a whole lot left in, the soil needs time to recover as well.
Yeah.
So like if you're going to reuse it, you really have to have a way you can kind of store it for a few months.
Regenerate it for the next year, basically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's challenging to just reuse it right then and there.
Yeah.
But it's something we're exploring. You know, we're trying to figure out ways of needing less and getting more out of it all the time. But for our situation right now, particularly because we are producing really high yields out of a relatively small amount of soil, it makes sense for us to still use fresh soil in this indoor setting and then use the spent soil in the outdoor setting or in the greenhouse setting. Also, there's a lot of IPM issues with reusing soil.
I'm sure.
And heavy metal buildup. And so, you know, we're real careful to make sure we're not running into those issues so they don't become bigger problems that then require more inputs and labor and all that sort of stuff.
So, Christine, let me ask you my last question here. What do plants crave? What does cannabis crave?
Yeah,
I mean, you could answer this question for all sorts of things.
So I think there's a whole lot of things, obviously, that they crave, and it can be everything from just like the essential nutrients to the right environment. But if I had to just generalize and say one thing that I think plants crave is care or attention. Because, and that is a little witchy, and maybe that isn't true. And I'm sure you could put a bunch of plants in a room and have them all automated and ran by, you know, a robot or something like that. And maybe that would be enough attention. I don't know. But I know from my experience that having that personal connection and personal attention between the people that are growing, the cultivators and the plants themselves, I think is mutually beneficial. It may be hard to quantify because, you know, how can you necessarily see what's happening or know that the impact is there? And I think there is more and more research showing how some of these connections actually work. But what I do know about plants is that the relationship between plants and people is beneficial to both, from my personal experience. And there's a value to that. And that's part of why I like growing at the smaller scale, because we're able to still have that individual connection. Even like right now, some of my cultivation technicians, some of our plants were hand watering instead of like automated watering. And the feedback I've gotten is that they are catching things before they become problems with the plants, whether it's like a pest or disease related. But then they're also feeling better about their job because of that connection, and they're able to put more of themselves and more of their energy into the labor because they feel that connection there. So I think it's still important to have a personal connection with the plants and to give them a level of attention to keep everything going in the right direction and to produce at the highest quality and level that you can. You know, one of my colleagues from like food production said, he had a quote one time on Twitter, and it was like, there's something about the slow relationship with plants. And I think about that a lot. There is something about the relationship you have with plants that's different than the relationship you have with people or animals or anything else, because it plays out so slowly, and the changes and the development are sometimes unnoticeable unless you step away for a few days, and then you come back, you're like, wow, you know, like look at how these plants changed in 3 or 4 days. So you can't see it necessarily happening, but that slow relationship is good for humans. I know that, because it's calming and it's therapeutic, and it offers like kind of like a meditative time when you're working with plants to maybe even learn some things about yourself or to regroup or reset. Like I know personally here on days, if I have days where I don't even see the plants, like I'm just on a computer all day, and I go back and I see the plants for the first time, I feel physically better. Like I don't know what it is, but like I don't know if it's the rooms, the lights, the plants, the oxygen, whatever is happening in those rooms. it seems like I physically get, you know, like I may have a headache and I may go into those rooms and my headache may kind of go away. And I don't know how to quantify that or say what's happening, but I know that the more time that I spend with the plants, kind of the healthier sometimes that I tend to feel. And so if that's the bacteria or the, you know, cannabinoids and terpenes in the air, I don't know what it is, but it's a combination of a lot of things that when I have a more direct relationship with the plants, I feel it's like holistically better for me and for the other employees. So like I did a little New Year's resolution or whatever, and it was to make sure that everyone in the business is engaging more directly with the plants and the different processes that they have, whether they're packaging or trimming or delivering. I think it's important for us all to have that hands-on sort of relationship with plants because of the therapeutic nature of it for us. But I think maybe there's a therapeutic nature of it for the plants as well. Like some of my technicians sing to the plants or,
do they?
you know, tell them stories or whatever. And I like it. I like the witchy side of it. I like the, you know, kind of seasonal ritualistic part of it all. And it does, you know, maybe sometimes collide with the science side, but I think there's a good balance there of having.
Well, I mean, so much of our human history and culture is built around food and seasons, seasonality. I mean, Thanksgiving, right? The harvest, celebrating the harvest. And, you know, it's probably no coincidence that Canada celebrates their Thanksgiving about a month earlier than we do, right? It's colder, right? Like they have to harvest sooner. So I think that all makes a lot of sense. And there's been studies that show that plants respond well to music and talking to them. I mean, why just talk to your pets? Let's talk to our plants as well.
For sure.
Yeah. And also, you know, I think it's so interesting how many people, I think what you're saying is a big reason why you find more growers or potential growers kind of gravitating towards cannabis cultivation as opposed to vertical farming or, you know, this other indoor production of say vegetables and fruits. You know, kind of same idea. You're in this artificial lit environment, right? You're not outside in nature, but it's like there's almost more of a willingness to do it with cannabis and these other facilities that are very heavily automated or trying to be heavily automated. So there's less plant touching. So I kind of feel like there's something there that one of the reasons you want to be growing these plants is because you want to have the interaction with the plants. But once you sort of sterilize it and you let the robots sing to the plants and harvest and do the transplanting, all you are at that point is a data scientist, right? Which people are data scientists. They like doing that. But if you're looking for growers and people to, you know, be paying attention to how the plant is responding to that data, it's sort of inert in a way.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, cannabis is cool because, I mean, it is kind of a magical plant. It creates these chemical compounds that interact with receptors in human beings' brains.
Yeah,
so
it's true.
I mean, there's definitely something going on there that this plant was designed to have this sort of connection with animals.
This human connection, yeah.
Beings. Totally. So, and it's also cool because it does, you know, it's a plant that you grow bigger. It's not like growing microgreens or something like that.
Right.
So you naturally can't grow as many of them. So you get to have a little bit, even if you're like right now we have 2,000 plants in flower. I mean, it's a lot of plants. We're definitely not having a personal relationship with each of them, but we at some point in the cycle are spending some time with each and every one of them.
Yeah.
You know, whereas with microgreens, it's really pretty hands off for the most part and stuff like that. But it's an interesting plant. It has a huge history of its relationship with human beings. Human beings have dispersed it all over the world, and it's grown in this like evolutionary relationship for a long time. So I know there's downsides to having a lot of interactions with plants, like spreading pests around or disease or things like that. But to me, I still feel like the value of having the relationship outweighs any of the negative impacts and is important to just the sustainability of the industry. I mean, it's a powerful relationship, and it leads us to make a lot of choices and do a lot of things to, continue to be able to have that relationship. So
yeah,
it's pretty cool.
I like that. All right, Christine. Well, you're not quite done yet. So I have a list of rapid fire questions.
Okay.
So just answer in one word or one sentence. Of course, if you want to expand on anything, please do, but they're meant to be sort of short and sweet.
Okay, gotcha.
All right. Are plants introverts or extroverts?
I think they're extroverts.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Can cannabis create a more sustainable world?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. What has the cannabis plant taught you?
Trust myself.
Ooh, I like that one. If you could ask researchers to study one thing about cannabis cultivation, what would it be?
Ooh, tough one. Wow, that's a really tough one. I guess the thing that I'm most interested in is finding out the relationship that cannabis has with various microbes.
Microbes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In the soil, I'm assuming.
In the soil, on the leaves, there's all kinds of places that they have relationships with them. But, finding out which ones have valuable relationships with cannabis is something I'm really interested in right now.
Yeah. Yeah, we tend to focus on the bad ones, not the good ones necessarily.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I'm kind of meaning more of the good ones.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Have you ever brewed beer with cannabis?
I've never even brewed beer. So that's my husband's job. He's a brewer.
Yeah, has he?
So he has not actually.
No?
But he's not much of a home brewer. So he's a commercial brewer.
Okay.
He works for Great Lakes actually. And so they have not there yet ever brewed beer with cannabis, but I think it's something that they're actively researching.
Okay. So if you had to pick a vegetable, fruit, or herb to make a flavored beer, what would you choose?
Oh, that would definitely be quince.
Really?
Yeah.
Does it make a sweet beer?
I don't know. I don't know if it's ever been brewed into a beer. I'm sure it probably has because it's an awesome fruit, but there was a quince tree in the garden, the ornamental garden next to my farm. It's not there anymore, unfortunately, but it was really old. And every year, no one wanted the quince because no one knew what to do with them. So I got all of them, which was awesome. And it was quite a lot. It would usually be like 30 pounds or so. And I would make quince jelly, quince pie, quince apple pie, quince syrup, everything that I could possibly extract into quince the flavor out of and put it into something I was doing because it is just one of the most exquisite flavors. If you've ever had quince jelly.
I have, yeah.
Yeah, I love the flavor of that. So that's one of my favorites. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I think, quince. For beer, it sounds like, and for everything else, you really don't hear a lot about quince products.
You don't hear a lot about it. No.
Interesting fruit. An undervalued, underappreciated fruit.
Strangely enough, I just bought some quince at the grocery store. I had Thanksgiving time, and I baked an apple pie, and I put just one quince, cut up the quince in it. It was the best apple pie I ever had. So
I don't even know what a quince looks like. It
looks like a big yellow pear that is very, very hard, and you can't bite into it. It's so hard. You really have to cook it to be able to eat it for the most part. It does soften up eventually, but it's not like a fruit that you just pull off the tree and you eat it. You gotta.
So did it give it like your apple pie a crunchy texture, or did you cook it down enough that it was soft like apple?
It had a little crunch to it, a little more, I guess, firmness to it than maybe the apple pieces. But it just gives it's kind of like a cross between an apple and a pear, and then it almost has a little bit of like an exotic floral sort of flavor side to it. So it's just, I can't really describe what it did for it, but it just gave it that extra something special. Yeah. Okay. It's like it's almost like an aromatic, but then it also just has like a sour, sweet flavor that is just very unique and very delicate, I guess. Really good.
All right, listeners, your homework is to go and find yourself some quince and try it and let us know how you like it.
You don't eat it raw.
Okay. Well, Christine, thank you so much for the conversation. We did really cover a lot of topics, and I appreciate everything that you are doing for the earth and for the soils. And for trying to make indoor cannabis production more sustainable.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for having me and spending all this time talking about sustainability in cannabis. Absolutely. And for all you do for all of our facilities everywhere else to make them more efficient from an HVAC side.
Awesome. We're trying. And things are changing all the time also with that technology and the science. So we're also trying to keep up with it and provide the best and greatest solutions. So
awesome.
Yeah. All right, Christine. Well, have a great rest of your day. Go visit your plants.
I am going to. I haven't seen them yet today. Awesome. Thanks. It was great chatting with you. Super fun. Awesome. Keep me posted on when things come out or whatever with the episode. So
we absolutely will.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks.
All right, cool. Thanks for your time.
You too.
Have a good one.
Bye.